This week, for my National Park Service announcement, instead of a where, it's a what. This year, National Public Lands Day is on Saturday, September 27th. Begun in 1994, that's 31 years ago, National Public Lands Day began as Public Lands Appreciation Day. It was a way then, as now, for people to get to know the public lands around them and to see everything public lands do for them, for the community, and the country. My little project here of highlighting a piece of the National Park Service has shown me that there are public lands everywhere, and they do a startling number of things. The National Park Service is one of the best ideas America has ever rolled out. This is such a huge country, we'll never know everything about it, but the national public lands are an amazing way to see things you'll never forget. And now, National Public Lands Day is a chance to get to know a piece of it near you in all new ways. First things first, it's a free entrance day. You'll have a chance to go to a local spot and get to know it in a whole new way, meet other people who are enthusiastic about the land as well, and you'll get to accomplish something tangible. And if there was ever a time our public lands needed some love and connections between the people who appreciate them the most, it would be now. To find your local Public Lands Day, go to the nps.gov page or more directly to the National Environmental Education Fund site. That is neefusa.org. This year, there will be at least one event in all 50 states and a big one at a place that has featured in a few episodes, Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia. So if you have a park nearby that you're curious about, Saturday, September 27th is a good day to get to know it. Check out nps.gov or neefusa.org for more information. Episode 154, Fashionable Vegetables from Europe and Stealth Ones from America. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at the emerging role of vegetables in the first half of the 19th century in America and the strange role fashion and hunger played in which vegetables would come out as fancy food in the latter half of the century. If you're curious about early American food trends or the very fact that we had them all the way back then, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that while the immigrants that made up the population of early America came from countries with food traditions, America, then as now, seems to have tended toward food fads instead. Unlike now, where there's much of a here today, and now your grandma knows about it, so it's gone tomorrow, in the 19th century, a food fad could take years or even decades to develop, and then peak, and then fade. And while this happened at a more fevered and well-documented pitch in the second half of the century, when there were finally newspapers everywhere, the forces that created the environment were in development in the first half. Now, I did say last episode that this episode was going to center around celery, but I was wrong. Celery madness doesn't really get going until the Gilded Age, the 1880s and on into the beginning of the next century. But for it to flourish, an infrastructure for fashionable foods generally, and for vegetable foods specifically, had to be set up. And that happened when we are now. So let's take a look at what it took to make celery cool and all the other vegetables and circumstances that will make this possible in the future. In order to have a food tradition transfer, you need two things to be true. First, you need the cooks or brewers with requisite knowledge to show up, and second, they need to be able to mold circumstances in the new place to the traditions in the old place. A decent example of this is the English and their apple traditions. 18th and 19th century apple growth and consumption are extremely similar in the old world and the new. And it certainly helped that apples grew like gangbusters from the start in America. And most of the apple traditions that transferred required minimal knowledge and effort on the preserving a tradition scale. I know that's a scale I just made up, but you get what I mean. But what if the majority of the people who come from the old country to the new country carry very little food knowledge with them, and they arrive with none of the foods they used to know? That was most of the people who came over in the first 50 years or so of colonized North America. They arrived largely grainless, fruitless, and vegetable-less. and so they promptly adopted corn, summer squashes, other squashes, pumpkin, and local beans, beach plums, maple syrup, sweet potatoes, strawberries, cranberries, and blueberries. Meat was less of an issue since for most people at this point, a deer was a deer, a bird was a bird, a fish was a fish, a rabbit was a rabbit, and most especially an oyster was most welcome. Adapting to local meat was not a problem, but adapting to local vegetable matter was. The solution was to adopt corn mush and pumpkin and bean succotash or die. But over time, food from the Old World was brought over. Sure, the Italians were having a ball, stuffing and batter frying squash blossoms and developing brothy mushroom-studded polentas as fascinating food from the New World, but Americans, as we became that, had a certain disdain for the foods that grew native to the soil we had claimed as our own. Instead, these early Americans were working to bring food from there, the Old World, to here, New America. And the goal was to recreate the world people, with greater and less fidelity, remembered as home. As modern society starts to look towards the planets and the stars as the place we want to go, what early America did about food, and continues to do with food, can offer some interesting and even unexpected thoughts. Just how we decided what to bring with us, and the consequences of that, should cross the mind of people deciding on what produce to send to the stars. In modern terms, the distance between England or Europe and North America in the 17th century is currently a bit like going to the moon, or maybe orbital space around Earth. The journey was certainly longer, but no less beset with dangers. On a per-voyager basis, I wouldn't be surprised if the fatality rate between 17th century transatlantic colonizers and 20th century space explorers wasn't pretty similar. Maybe setting up a colony was more deadly since the planning and resources dedicated to it were fewer. But for my purposes, the interesting part lies in the food. A 20th century space explorer and a 17th century colonizer start by taking with them everything they need. The challenges of each journey severely limited what sorts of foods could be taken. I'm specifically leaving out 21st century space food, which has taken advantage of advances in food preservation and dehydration tech, and new understandings around texture and flavor perception. But back to our travelers. Venturing out beyond any regular contact with home base, what was essential to bring in each case? For the spaceship and ocean ship traveler, you had to bring everything. In both cases, once you set out, every drop of water you drank, every calorie you consumed must be considered, made stable, and packed. The difference was, once our colonizers got to where they were going, and once our eventual space travelers decide on a destination, decisions have to be made about what is important to have in stores to set up society, especially in the ranks of vegetable foods. In both cases, obviously, at the beginning, it's the essentials. For our sea travelers, it was grains and trees. Rye and wheat slowly displaced corn. Apple and pear, and depending on where one lived, plum, peach, apricot, and cherries arrived and became common. In some cases, even pushing out the strawberries and blueberries that had been here, and almost entirely erasing some of the harder-to-cultivate fruits that most modern Americans have never even heard of, like ground cherries, service berries, beach plum, pawpaw, persimmons, chokecherries, mulberries, and the foxy and sweet native grapes like muscadine and concord. Incidentally, those are actually what grape flavor in candy is referring to. Lettuces and bitter greens like chicory and dandelion were grown in favor of native leafy greens like amaranth, wood sorrel, young squash leaves, and the leaves from bean vines. Lamb quarters, aka corn salad for its tendency to grow in and among corn plants. Also lost was purslane, which has varieties that grow both in Europe and America, and to be honest, it has a more difficult texture than the more popular large leafy greens. So has kind of gone by the wayside in both locations. Nettles were displaced. Now, they are tasty and extremely nutritious, but their stingy nature requires timing, skill, and dedication on the part of the harvester. Green leaf lettuce and spinach, while they require cultivation, will never burn your arms like fire with their spines. The native Jerusalem artichoke was happily shoved aside by the imported turnips, which also have tasty tops, and then were further displaced by the extremely popular and even tastier potato. While Jerusalem artichokes were dependable and fairly easy to grow in great numbers, their propensity for causing intestinal discomfort and, as it was termed in the day, the wind, these artichokes were happily pushed out of the pantry as soon as was practicable by early American cooks and eaters. Ramps, while locally popular, were no match for the onion, which was great for storing, and as the country's food practices changed, it shipped extremely well too. So by the beginning of the 19th century, an American diet that leaned heavily on what vegetable foods we brought to the space station from Europe was well established. The notable exception of beans, corn and squash, and soon potatoes would get added in. America has always had its eyes on what foods could be made to pay. Salt cod, beef tongue, hams and pig lard, sassafras leaves, tobacco. Okay, it's a vegetable product even if it is a drug. Dried cranberries, distilled apple spirits. So the vegetable world, as supremely seasonal and perishable as it was, offered very little in the way of money makers in the early days of our growing food for survival and for export. But things started to change in the early 19th century. Navigation had improved markedly, as had ship design. What had been a multi-month slog in a wallowing barge in 1670 whatever to a destination that was sort of America-ish had by the early 18 teens become a predictable trip that usually topped out at about 2 months. Sea captains had brass compasses with strong, dependable magnets, well-tested navigational charts and rudders, lunar charts and watches that allowed them to track longitude, that is, how far east or west they were, so the journeys had become common and easier to do. Unlike that boat of Protestant weirdos headed in a Virginia-ish direction at the start of the 17th century, now if you left London, headed for Philadelphia, you could pretty much depend that you would eventually get to Philadelphia, and you'd know if you were in Boston or Newport or New York or Charleston instead. And this whole farming thing was really starting to work out. A loaf of bread was accessible for most people. A bowl of stew with mush was attainable for just about everyone. And often it could even come with a glass of beer or cider or clean well water or a mug of tea, green or raspberry leaf, depending on your lights. And with that, people started noticing that the food that they were getting was kind of boring. Yes, there was nutmeg and cinnamon and cloves and ginger to be had, especially if you were rich enough to know how to read and write, but the original complement of vegetable foods, now that most people weren't mostly hungry all the time, were starting to feel distinctly limited. And so people started looking abroad for what they might bring along to brighten things up. And snobs that these early Americans were, did they hunt for treasures in their own woods and start the hard work of developing and cultivating things for growing as crops? Alas, no. They looked back. What could America bring in from the cultivars in Europe? And thus begins the American attribution of sophistication to vegetables from Europe, both the cultivars grown and the methods of preparation. Even in these early days, providing seeds and vegetable starts had been long part of the kitchen garden experience. Some people definitely had the knack. The unique American experience in the 17th, 18th, and even 19th century of setting off to pioneer it and do it all for themselves was somewhat novel in an age when most people believed that without your community support, you're gonna die. It really did take a village to survive. There was no way to make it on your own without unbelievable levels of work and incredible luck. And even those who thought to strike out on their own regularly sent someone back to villages, towns, and communities made up of extended families to resupply the things they couldn't make for themselves. And the loners, they'd often come in for grocery runs before going off to spend more time alone. But for those people who are feeling happy to be settled in a town or a village or in a communal atmosphere of a large, prosperous farm, the desire for variety was growing. When you look at the cookbooks, printed or manuscript, before the 19th century, they have definite gaps of what we in the 21st century consider to be regular food. And so it is in these years of earliest America, when we're now a country, Having explained with firearms to the English that we are on our own, we start to supplement the basics in the vegetable world we began with. And we're going to almost exclusively use Europe as the source of what's to be coveted. I mean, joke's on us, half the time the origin of the thing was America. So what vegetable foods started to become markedly more popular in this time? Now that we had this hunger thing tamped down, what showed up in seed and flour advertisements to savor at our table now that we had at least a little time to enjoy our food? Tomatoes are one of the first things that really started to spread. Joke's on us, since we generally saw them as a Spanish food. Gazpacho, that cold tomato and cucumber soup thickened with bread, gained traction as a cooling dish for the summer and as a way to deal with fast days when you couldn't eat meat. And if one was particularly abandoned, you could add garlic to the mix. In places that enslaved a large number of West Africans, tomatoes also arrived in dishes out of these kitchens as gumbos, jambalayas, and even vegetable dishes of tomatoes and okra. After all, the Portuguese and Spanish had dropped off tomatoes there in the 16th and 17th centuries, and they had been happily adopted. Potatoes began to become extremely popular at this time. The starchy white kind were making their debut all over North America. Seen as an import from the French and the Irish, the American origin of these tubers from the mountainous regions of South America would be obscured for decades. Potatoes were a bit unique because not only were they popular as a vegetable, their umbrella-shaped flowers were also popular on spring table arrangements. This was one of the plants that would make money for people selling seed starts and designing gardens. 19th century America enjoyed boiled potatoes in stews and on the side of dishes with butter and gravy. Salt roasted potatoes and the emerging Saratoga potatoes, the precursor of the potato chip, were also making their rounds as fashionable preparations. But the imported French idea of cutting little potatoes out of bigger potatoes and then preparing these in different ways, such as frying them in butter and parsley a la lyonnaise, or boiling the little potatoes in lard to make fried potato balls a la Parisienne, were the height of sophistication. Bell peppers. While we can get these year-round in our vegetable system that takes advantage of both an extensive cold chain and greenhouses, these large, hollow, fruity pepper pods have been cultivated and expanded in southern Central Europe from the early examples brought back by the Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spain and Hungary and their neighbors were going mad for all manner of paprikas, the dried spice powder, smoked, sweet, semi-spicy, and so on. But Americans, more enamored of black pepper and a little cayenne, saw the bell pepper, especially stuffed, as the height of sophistication. The use of pepper cases to hold meat mixtures was both a curiosity and a mark of being in the know. Because we imported the seeds of this capsicum variety from Europe, and our global sailors saw spicy chili peppers in all parts of India, China, and in innumerable parts of West Africa, the South American origin of the bell peppers was obscure to Americans for decades as well. And there's one more odd twist with bell peppers. That's oil mangoes. At this point in early 19th century America, we had only heard of mangoes secondhand, mostly from the British. And the only way most British knew mangoes was as a preserved fruit that was destined for chutneys and relish. And it was common to receive them green, preserved in oil. The large seed had been removed from the center, and the cavity was stuffed with a mixture of spices. The lush, juicy, sweet fruit of Central Asia and Indonesia was completely unknown to them and us. And so, instead of a noun, to mango became a verb. You could mango small underripe melons, and you could mango some round melon-shaped soft summer squash, and you could mango bell peppers. That is, you leave them whole, but cut a slit in the side and scoop out a cavity in the middle. The seeds in green melons and summer squash, or in the case of peppers, well, there was a cavity already there. Your fruit of choice was to be taken whole, preferably those larger than a goose egg, and they were to be submerged in boiling salted water. The next day, a slit was cut and the seeds removed. In the case of the peppers, the slit was immediately cut so water could get inside and they were possible to submerge at all. After 8 days in brine, they would be stuffed with a mixture of reconstituted dried ginger root, horseradish, mustard seed, chopped onion, mace, nutmeg, turmeric, black pepper, all made into a paste with some sweet oil. The paste was stuffed into the cavity of each fruit that is to be mangoed, along with a clove of garlic. Covered with the best vinegar, these mangoes would keep well and were used as the base of relishes, stuffings, sauces, and dressings. Because of this verb to mango vegetables, all the way through the end of the 20th century, there were pockets of America where bell peppers, especially the green ones, could be labeled in a fruit stand or grocery store as, you guessed it, mangoes. Another misnomer in the vegetable world are the French beans, which began to gain popularity in this period. While the American bean, all the kidney-shaped ones, were known and grown in almost every garden in America to be dried and used for all manner of winter soup or stew, eating the immature pod of these beans as a sophisticated and even delicate vegetable started to become popular in this age. Back in the 17th century, drying the pods on lines to save them to be reconstituted in stews had given bean pods the name of leather breeches. This led them to be seen as a survival, deep winter, and poverty food. But when the French showed the way with picking them when they were extremely immature, blanching them to keep their vivid green, and then dousing them in luxurious amounts of salted butter, the pedestrian string bean became the French bean. Cookbooks would even admonish the ambitious cook that it was acceptable to use beans that must be cut in half and split down the middle for the common table, but for those who are nice, quote, do not use them at such a growth that requires splitting, unquote. And this is why cut-up green beans are called French beans or Frenched. Americans, instead of picking beans when they were tiny and tender, just decided cutting them down to size was French enough. Which makes me wonder, does that mean that the baby carrots should really be called Frenched carrots? Never mind. If anything, this manner of green bean cookery began to take over the long green vegetable spot from asparagus, from sea kale, and even from chard. Salads were arriving on tables, which meant salad dressing in the vinaigrette style was also arriving to dress them. Oil and vinegar and either mustard or egg yolks were mixed in to get the two halves to stay together. Black pepper or powdered cayenne pepper was usually the spice, and cream and butter were added to enrich things, or used in the place of oil when oil was not available. While we think of salads as vegetable dominant, a 19th century salad, early or late, could just as easily be mostly meat. That is, shrimps, chicken, sweetbreads, cold-boiled tongue, and so on. But in the vegetable realm, salad greens were getting more various as the popularity of the cold vegetable dish increased. Cabbage as coleslaw, adopted from the Dutch dish of raw cabbage dressed in hot seasoned butter, was evolving. The cabbage in this dish was usually the smooth-leafed cabbage that, when grown to its largest size, is the base for sauerkraut. But the softer, ridged cabbage, known now as Savoy, was a popular European newcomer. Instead of developing the leafy greens that were literally popping out of the ground in America, we decided to go with European lettuces. The field peas or starchy peas that had been packed in boats to get us over here, that us modern people only find in split pea soup and now as pea protein, still held plenty of table space in the early 19th century. But the race for a sweeter green or immature pea was on. Developing and selling a sweeter spring pea was in fact one of the first durable food fads of the American age. Adopted from the spring pea madness that gripped England each year, Americans were a bit less dotty about it, but advertisements for the sweetest spring peas were common then and endure now. Green corn, as a popular vegetable for polite company, was gaining ground as well. Here, when I reference green corn, I mean immature corn. Just as back in episode 19, when I talk about the moon being made of green cheese, Green is not referencing a color, rather saying that is immature. Here in modern America, when we see corn on an ear, we expect it to be soft and edible as a vegetable. But back in the 19th century, corn was a hard grain. Mature corn is fully grown and then dried to be made into animal feed or cornmeal. And this still is the fate of almost all corn ever grown. But the green corn they're referring to is to be eaten as a soft vegetable. Before the 19th century, this was a strange practice of the Indian, of the early colonizer, and of the frontier farmer unable to wait any longer to get at fresh food. But by the first half of the 19th century, as with peas, farmers were starting to play about with the idea of growing some corn varieties specifically to be eaten green, that is, immature. And so it was boiled, stewed, and made into corn pudding. And as we know, canning was coming along nicely, so the idea of canned, creamed corn was in development. Asparagus and artichokes had come in some of the earliest shipments of European vegetables. The perennial nature of both of them made them overall lower effort crops. Once asparagus roots are established, they'll just send up sprouts each spring, no need to plant. And in warm enough climates, artichokes and their cousins cardoons will simply produce flowers and the stalks that we eat. This persistent nature seems obvious once you remember that they are both members of the thistle family, which is a stubborn invader if there ever was one. Well, late spring through early fall was the vegetable bonanza, when all of these vegetables of fashion were most enjoyed. It was the late fall into winter and early spring that presented the greatest challenge. While America, with its iron stoves, growing network of hard-surfaced roads, and an expanding postal system, was exhibiting the early signs of a budding modern, or at least industrial age, refrigeration and freezing remained a novelty. So the vegetables to be eaten in the winter were salted and pickled. And if one desired a fresh vegetable, that is, unsalted, then one had to depend on root vegetables and hard winter squashes. And so the last class of interesting vegetables adopted from Europe's pantry began to expand. America gathered up varieties of turnips and beets and parsnips and carrots. Salsify had been an early import and persisted through the early 19th century as a common vegetable. It is low effort to grow and happily hangs out underground just waiting to be eaten. But digging it up is much trouble. It's long and you have to dig deep, and it requires long cooking. So when compared to the sweetness of the turnip, the beet, and the parsnip, and even the carrot and pumpkin, it's no wonder it went out of style in America at this time. Because that's the other thing. America started to produce an impressive amount of butter and lard, and if there's one thing everyone could agree upon at the time, especially in an age predating central heating, nothing improves the taste of all these vegetables, from potatoes to corn to mashed turnips, is the generous addition of fat. I mean, unless you're the adherent of some of the frugal living diet fads like our friend the vegetable diet back in episodes 128 and 129. In that case, you'd be saving your soul, or your masculinity, with a nice dish of unsalted boiled turnips or a bowl of unsalted stewed pumpkin, probably with the stingy guts left in for more virtue. But those Protestant weirdos aside, while much of the rest of the world was working on improving and widening their pickling expertise, America turned to saucing their plain boiled vegetables with butter, or to the newfangled idea of frying them. Pickling may have been a tradition we brought with us, even if it was largely the hot brine and hot vinegar sort rather than the fermentation type. We left pickling behind, and instead we went for either canning our vegetables or adding fat to our vegetables. And because we were stuck with the idea that all the best vegetables came from Europe and making them the cool new thing, we separated these vegetables from their established food traditions and lost a large range of the ways that they were used. Oh yeah, and we lost the better, more flavorful, but requiring more patience pickling techniques. Americans were in a hurry and kept defaulting to the cooked in vinegar pickling techniques. And then once canning came along, especially when it went industrial, we almost entirely abandoned flavoring our preserved vegetables. And that was a crime, definitely a food crime. So you'll notice that some familiar stuff isn't particularly present. Notice carrots are largely absent? That's not an accident. At this point, carrots and parsnips are entirely cooked vegetables. Think of the flavor of those yellow and purple and white rainbow carrots you can get. They are sharp and often quite tough. The sweet, tender, bright orange carrot we enjoy today was still in development. It existed, but it wasn't widespread. And celery is also largely a no-show. It was starting to show up, but at this point it was notoriously fussy to grow, so like truffles was mostly a pretty rarefied rich people dish. Cauliflower is around, but it was sort of here from the beginning. Broccoli and its sulfury green relatives like rapini, it's still in the wings, waiting for the arrival of more Southern European immigrants. Because we have developed a steady and relatively abundant food production machine in America, particularly when compared to the relatively crowded and increasingly war-trampled Europe, we now have time to want more, and more will start to come, but in fits and starts and fads. Disconnected from the traditional roles, the American that has been here in North America for the past 50 to 150 years will think of themselves as the native. Sure, we love your crazy hollow pepper pod. It's so much fun to cook with, but your tradition of salt ferment pickling radishes, that's weird. As America got more interested in foods from afar, the nativism is going to start to kick in hard. And if you want to rouse up political sentiment of some sort, you're going to need to hold some meetings. Now, at this point in the early 19th century, almost every daylight hour is used for work. Meetings, those take place at night, and to do that, you'll need some light. Now, candles are good and all for a single person or a small gathering, but lanterns are much better for spaces with more people, and wax isn't so great for lanterns. Besides, beeswax is spendy. If only there was some other thing that was good for lighting things up. Well, it turns out there is, even if it is awfully stinky. And that's whale oil. Before electricity lights up the world in about 100 years from now, there's the intermediate step of whale oil as a worldwide lighting product. So, light up some patchouli, get out your dusting cloths, and join me next episode for the continuing saga of whale products in America. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. And thanks to all of you who have written something. Spotify and some of the other podcatchers even have space to leave comments. So, back I go to the history books to learn about what takes Americans around the globe, beyond those voyages for tea to China. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all of this information is available in the show description.